Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure that it's different time zones across the world, obviously. So for some of you it'll be very early and some of you it'll be very late, and some, like myself in the UK, it'll be around midday. So thank you for joining us at whatever time it is for you today. On our discussion to discuss strategies to counter backlash, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a conversation that's getting more and more pertinent by the day. So again, as I'm sure you're all aware, the very ideas, let alone the possibilities of gender and social justice, are under attack across the world. These attacks are becoming increasingly acute, and they're seeking to erase language, movements, normative and legal frameworks, and even entire communities. So in this context, this session asks, how can gender and social justice activists survive this current moment? And how can we strategize and organize, not only to counter and to resist, but also to build the queer, decolonial and feminist futures that have never yet been realized? So before we launch into our discussion, I just want to remind everyone that this session will be recorded, and we'll be able to share the recording after the event. And there's also the Q&A function at the bottom. So please do, as questions arise as speakers are speaking, please do put questions in the chat, in that Q&A box. And also we'll have a time for plenary at the end. So looking forward to a collective discussion towards the end. But before that, we'll be hearing from a series of brilliant speakers, each of which work together on the CEDA-funded Countering Backlash programme. In this programme, we seek to understand both the nature of backlash, as well as effective strategies to survive, counter, and to overcome it together. Today, our discussion will be structured around the toolkit Cards Against Backlash Towards a Feminist Future. And this toolkit draws upon real-life tactics that have been identified across the programme, as well as leaving open discussion for many more strategies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers who will discuss this more in depth. And I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to each speaker as we go, but speakers, please do introduce yourself more fully as we speak. So we're going to start with Tessa Lewin, a research fellow and educator at IDS, and one of the authors of the Cards Against Backlash. So Tessa, could you tell us more about the concept and the ideas behind Cards Against Backlash and the modes of countering backlash discussed within them?
Sure. Thanks, Chloe. Hi, everyone. So as you probably know, Countering Backlash is a research program that seeks to understand backlash, but also to identify strategies to counter it and to understand new opportunities for feminist action and impact within the context of shrinking civic space. And we work with partners in Brazil, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Turkey, Uganda, and Serbia, some of whom you will hear from today. And I manage part of this program with Rosie McGee, a strand called Policy and Practice. And one of the research processes that we conducted as part of this in our strand was a series of counter backlash observatories, which aimed to capture real-time counter backlash dynamics over the period of the research program, which we would then collectively analyze and reflect on to look for any high-level trends and patterns. And the observatory was meant to be a device for kind of framing, structuring, and systematizing the gathering of data about counter backlash dynamics. And also central to our work is Becky, who you'll hear from later, who is a senior research fellow at IDS and works on gender, digital development, and increasingly on AI. And Becky and I were chatting about the material that had come out of the observatories, and we have a shared kind of history and passion, I guess, for policy and comms advocacy work, and we wanted to find a way of representing some of the research findings in a more accessible and non-academic way. And this was kind of in the lead up to AWID, so we wanted something also for that audience. And we were particularly interested in some of the findings that were coming out of the observatory workshops, one in particular, which was that survival was very much seen as a kind of resistance strategy, the idea that holding steady is enough in the times that we're in. And so we decided to put together these cards, and we wanted not to oversimplify the research, the very rich research that people were doing, but not to present any kind of blueprint for backlash resistance, but to inspire people with some of the stories. We put a lot of thought into the ethics of how we present it, because there was a tension between kind of anonymization and generalization for safety and accessibility, but also we wanted enough detail that they made some kind of a sense. So we started with the material from our observatories meetings, and we did a kind of grounded clustering of some of the strategies that were coming out of this. And once we got the themes, then everything fell into place really easily. And Chloe and Ben got involved in kind of helping to author the cards as well. So we found 6 strategies, which were surviving and centering care, agile activism, creating coalitions, language and stories, careful digital practice, and capacity building. And then we grouped these into 3 broad aims: surviving, which is our pause category, resisting, which was our stop category, and creating feminist futures, which is our kind of playing forward category. And hopefully you've all had a look at the cards. But we also wanted to put them in a kind of easily accessible digital format. So they are on Instagram as well. And the last 2 cards are a set of resources, and also a how do you do it, which was a kind of nod to the fact that we want people to think about their own strategies and engage with this on their own terms and in their own context. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. And I believe I'm handing over to
Tessa. Yeah, we're moving over to Betty, who is going to speak about our first theme, which is survival. So Arundhati, through your work as a research associate with Gender at Work, and I know also many other things, in what ways have you encountered survival as a necessary aspect of countering backlash?
Thanks so much, Chloe. The insights I will be sharing right now are from 3 different strands of research that my colleagues Shraddha, Sudarshana, and I have been doing under the Countering Backlash program over the last few years. This research has also been in close collaboration with Bebak Collective, which is a network of Muslim women's rights organizations, and Shehri Maíra Kamgar Union, which is an organization based in New Delhi that collectivizes and organizes domestic workers. So to respond to the question that Chloe asked, in what ways have we encountered survival? It's very easy to blur the lines between what is a direct manifestation of backlash and subtle counter-backlash strategies. What can look like a chilling effect and a censorship of a whole sector can also look like strategic silence under the folds of which subversive organizing continues to happen, and vice versa. The more optimistic amongst us can end up imbuing agency into situations and actors that may not have it in those specific moments. And therefore, we feel that survival kind of occupies this middle gray zone between the impacts of backlash, this direct manifestation, and the agency of visible countering, visible active countering. But it also speaks to this need for hope and for continuing to feel like we are doing something in the face of something that feels constantly abating. This is something that a lot of respondents spoke to, the need for that reframing of what is happening to us as also something that we are choosing to do. And so at this point in time, when there's such an intense pushback, it's important to recognize the everyday acts of resistance. Simply holding the line is a significant win. When reversals and gains are so rampant the world over, and we know this, simply preventing a backsliding of rights is a gain. And so what I'm trying to do is recasting surviving as holding the line on feminist rights and organizing strategies. One of these strategies to hold the line has been simply to continue to do quotidian work of community level organizing, even as spaces of more visible policy advocacy slip away. As one of our research participants said, every act of defying the government by upholding women's rights, however small it may be, is a radical act. So things that were not radical earlier are becoming radical. Many feminist groups are then focusing on their core work of improving access to rights and entitlements, providing services to GBV survivors, supporting income generation activities, leadership development of women, all of which can fly under the radar, but continues to hold the line on what have been gains made. Deeply tied in with this is the work of continuing to create safe spaces of learning, sharing, and dialogue within and between communities. This was especially the case for organizations that worked with marginalized and particularly Muslim youth, using sports, cultural events to create positive addas or spaces to channel positive affect and continue to promote ideas of composite culture, peace, and justice. This holding on of space to meet and speak also extends to the interstices between organizations, especially when funding for networks and rights-based collectives is drying up and coming under scrutiny. Organizations and activists are continuing to hold on to strategies of building feminist conscientization in smaller pockets, and continuing to build autonomous organizing in smaller pockets. And that also feels like survival in the sense of nurturing, continuing to nurture politics, continuing to nurture a new generation of feminists that are coming under the fold at a time when everything is under attack. A lot of feminist institutions also spoke about this as a time of extremely choppy seas, this metaphor of like extremely choppy seas and some boats being just too small to sail out to sea at this time. And so therefore taking this time to fix our masts, taking this time to build better, more inclusive, more sustainable organizations from within, doing more deliberate work of ensuring that when we are able to sail out again, that we will be more equipped to deal with bigger storms. And we also realize that what I'm saying largely tells the story of survival for those who have experienced direct full frontal attacks on their existence. But when we look at groups like domestic workers who have been holding the line for years, there have been long-term pushbacks for rights and organizing, and have a big part of how backlash has manifested against them is in the form of sustained inaction. And in the face of that kind of backlash, and in the face of sustained inaction, actually, even survival looks like wanting and needing and pushing for visibility. And so that's the full gamut of what we are kind of experiencing. And even though domestic workers fear sanctions from the state, they continue to look for more visible spaces to organize, whereas women's rights organizations and Muslim women's rights organizations specifically are looking for spaces to go under and become more subversive. So it's been a fairly large and fluid spectrum on which survival has centered itself as a strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arundhati, and that boat metaphor is incredibly helpful, I think, for picturing what it is that you're talking about. Nai, we're going to move over to you. As an activist and a researcher for the Arab Institute for Women in Lebanon, could you tell us a little about the need for agile activism within Lebanon and what that looks like in the context of countering backlash?
Hi, thanks again for bringing us all together. So basically, if we want to talk about backlash in Lebanon and feminist activism trying to survive or resist it, we often talk about backlash as a legacy of structures, basically, and that it's not something that comes out of the blue and happens once every couple of years and then recedes. So when speaking about structures, we are seeing increasingly in Lebanon the resurfacing of colonialism and settler colonialism as a structure, not only as an analytic in the social sciences and in anthropology, but also importantly as a lived experience for so many of the Lebanese. So it's a structure that is sustained by the colonial entity's right to maim, kill, destroy, and subjugate. And as many of you know, certainly the IDS team, the Countering the Backlash team knows, between September and November 2024, just last year, Lebanon has lived under a massive Israeli war. There was the dropping of bunker buster bombs of thousands and thousands of pounds on dense neighborhoods in Beirut, the invasion of South Lebanon after a wholesale decimation of tens of towns, and systematic targeting of the area's health sector, the putting of like countless hospitals out of service, and the targeting of ambulances and paramedics, and the killing of over 200 of those. The transformation of entire neighborhoods in Beirut into legitimate targets of fire has certainly like showcased how colonialism and settler colonialism can be a structure that basically overtakes the entirety of life in a particular country. So after 65 days of intense fire on the country, ended with a ceasefire end of November, which also there have been breaches of that over 300 times according to conservative estimates, and the ongoing occupation of multiple points in the south of Lebanon. And so since October of 2023, we've seen Lebanon has counted over 4,000 martyrs, 15,000 injured, over 1.2 million internally displaced people who are yet to return to their towns. And speaking of backlash and speaking of violence in activist circles, or like how feminists look at it, I am a 39-year-old feminist, Lebanese feminist, and this is the third Israeli war in my lifetime. And so the Lebanese joke in general about having seen it all, and except obviously a giant asteroid striking the country, but the war was the cherry on top, and it positioned society at a nexus of overlapping vulnerabilities and overlapping crises. So the war unfolded against the background of an oligarchic rule that oversaw a massive financial collapse and a severe devaluation of the local currency that started in 2019, a massive explosion in the capital's port that decimated half of the city of Beirut in 2020, the ongoing ruling class deliberate neglect of the economic crisis ever since, and the resulting disintegration of the services infrastructure, leading to a mass exodus of the Lebanese. And so in terms of agile activism, I would say feminist activism in Lebanon is by definition, is by default agile and flexible by virtue of having to operate in challenging and devastating circumstances. But I want to zoom in on the summer of 2023 to make that point further. That summer saw an alarming escalation and the intensified scapegoating of queer communities, refugees, and an overall incitement against NGOs, broadly like a big umbrella of NGOs, to frame them as the enemies of an imagined heteropatriarchal conservative model of a Lebanese family. So for context, Lebanon has yet to repeal Article 534 of the country's penal code, which basically criminalizes unnatural sex without specifying anything further. So this is a relic of the French colonial era, and it's Lebanon's most publicly debated regulation on sexuality. So the last decade, but with that, the last decade still saw increased activism for sexual freedoms, queer-friendly bars, and spaces opening, celebrities openly praising their sexuality. And so the deployment of sexuality policing to manufacture moral and sex panics over the heteropatriarchal nuclear family has been a constant feature of governance in Lebanon. It's a structural issue. So anti-queer campaigns ebbed and flowed in the past years based on the optics and requirements of a junctural political moment instigated by, obviously, the political and religious authorities. So, but the root of this escalation started in June, in the year before that, in June of 2022, when a video showing the vandalization of a floral installation on a billboard celebrating Beirut Pride went viral. So in this video, a group of men under the name of Jnoud al-Rab, or Soldiers of God, who proclaimed themselves as the ultimate defenders of God and the Christian community, against particularly endeavors such as the LGBT community and civil marriage. They were seen ripping off this installation. And this triggered a wave of renewed moral panic around the issue and gradually escalated from June 2022, from a slew of troubling remarks by political authorities to this group's extremist Christian group's full-blown attack on a queer-friendly bar in August 2023, and then another full-blown attack on a protest calling for the protection of personal and political freedoms. And agile activism comes in. So the general ambiance of lawlessness and increasing violations against women and refugees, openly and in public spaces, these groups' attacks that are seen as part of a wider trend in Lebanon and the region of escalating rhetoric and violence against queer communities, saw a retreat of feminist, queer, and women's groups, women's rights organizing to online spaces where direct physical harm is less possible. And the fact that this was happening in tandem with a movement, a moment of global panic around the issue, and in tandem with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, also, I think, emboldened these attacks and further forced us to think or rethink our strategies from actively resisting to just laying low until the moment passes. And so just to wrap up, I want to reiterate the point of backlash being a legacy or an output of structures, and talk about a conceptualization of the state in Lebanon that Maíra put forward a few years ago, called the epidermal state. It's very important to keep in mind that women, vulnerable groups like women, queer, migrant workers, refugees, the incarcerated, and the others have always lived under a very obvious, very violent, and a very, sovereign state that basically materialized its sovereignty on their own bodies through violence and bureaucracy. So these episodes of violence ebb and flow, as I say, but are not new and require by default agility and flexibility to resist them.
Thank you so much, Mai. But yeah, that proving that need for kind of constant agility and flexibility as these ebbs and flows unfold. So we're going to move to Antara. If you could talk to us a little bit about the need for careful digital practice through your work, or as you've discovered through your work and research with the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh, please.
Thank you, Chloe. So in Bangladesh, we are under this Countering Backlash Reclaiming Gender Justice program. We conducted research mainly looking at the types of and the severity of gender-based violence happening in the online space and how activists were countering them. So online gender-based violence itself as an issue, it became a very complex issue because activists were, everyone was kind of actually struggling to understand the severity and deep impact of this online violence and online activism. So as the social media has amplified the voice, so as the backlash against feminist movements. And in our research, we talked with activists who are both active online and offline, and we found some of the strategies effective for some, but gradually they also became ineffective because of the continuous change in the technology and in the tech world. So it's kind of a difficult thing to have some concrete strategy to countering backlash, but rather it is actually evolving with the time. And in very recent time, some of the things we have found effective, but very recently we have seen one of the safety strategy becoming very less reliable. To give you an example, so activists and allies are used to some alternative or safer languages, generic terms like gender justice or gender diverse group to protect LGBTQI communities or LGBTQI activists because they are violently attacked. But this use of generic terms, this is also currently now at risk because anti-feminist groups, they have been very actively exposing these terms, and they have been, publishing their type of narrative, that how activist and development organizations have been using this term to actually promote LGBTQI rights. So these tactics now have been countering the backlash or countering the violence or harassment against activists in online is actually a very complex issue. And sometimes the struggle is also sometimes when we talk about safety strategy, it sounds very much restrictive, and sometimes it places the burden of safety on the activist or on the victim of this violence themselves. But still, we have to resist this thing, resist the backlash, and we have found that some of the strategies, those are very much self-learned. So there were no appropriate legal mechanism, or not an established form of mechanism that we activists can go to for help seeking or for support seeking. So those are basically self-learned, whether they have faced, one group faced something, they counter it and they found effective, and they passed on to their peer network, passed on their friends. So the one very effective was like using secure communication channels, so that to prevent them public disclosure of their strategies or event details, or maintaining separate accounts to detach their personal information, personal account, which can use to track them, to identify them, and then further escalate the attack on them. Sometimes using social media moderation panels found very effective. So who will clean up the hate comments, clean up all the negative messages, this type. And in general, practicing the general hygiene, for example, using strong password, enabling multi-factor authentication, those very usual practice of not sharing personal details, keeping regular data backups, that kind of found effective for some period of time. But one thing that also observed and came very prominent, that these precautions that needs to be practiced not just at individual levels, but in a very collective. So in Bangladesh, the digital literacy is not very high, and in the grassroots level, where internet connections are not that good, and digital literacy education is not very well structured in here. So this having the knowledge of how to combat it differs from national to local level, and that's why this practice needs to be very collective way, and there needs to be effective communication among peer groups, because you may be one may be understand the risk, they may protect themselves, but allies and other peer groups, they sometimes also can make the situation worse, or no, sometimes information can get public. So the peer group, the ally network, they have to also understand their responsibility of having safe networking, safer use of online practice. And another thing is, we often talk about that what to do when a violence happen in person, when an attack, when someone is attacked physically or someone is attacked in person. Then we taught what to do, where to go for support, what should be the immediate reaction. But when things happen in the digital realm, we usually don't talk about that. What should be the immediate actions to be, what one should do, how to document what is happening for further, advocacy or taking any legal actions. So when an individual organization is attacked, it is essential to know where to seek help. And over the years, we have seen that activists, they have also been able to create their support group. They have created various platforms, networks of technical support, network of legal support, which they can go for immediate help. So yeah, and they have also been practicing very I mean, how to respond to when an attack is happening, rather becoming very aggressive, but responding in a very safer way that would not escalate the situation very much. So yeah, I'll stop there and maybe come back later for questions.
Thank you so much, Antara. And yeah, as Antara said, there will be time for questions at the end. So please do putting them into the Q&A box so that after our speakers are finished, we can have a plenary discussion and questions and also comments. Maíra, moving to you. Building coalitions are essential for building feminist futures. Could you tell us a little bit about coalition building in the context of your work, activism, and research for the nucleus of interdisciplinary studies on women in Brazil?
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Chloe, for your question. What I'm going to share now is the result of obviously a collective reflection made with the researchers from NEIM, Federal University of Bahia, and we have been thinking a lot about coalitions. And well, first of all, coalitions are formed out of the necessity in the fight for rights. I think that's very important to stress, because the same agenda can be addressed concurrently in different ways by different groups without converging. So a coalition comes about when there is first a shared perception that the same strategy needs to be adopted in order to advance the conquest of rights, or in order to resist, to retain rights that have already been gained in periods of backlash and are threatened in periods of backlash. And second, this perception of common ground being stronger than the difference that separate the organizations. So coalitions require dialogue. Coalitions often bring together groups from different social origins, ethnic origins, gender and sexual orientation backgrounds. So in the case we are examining in more details, which is the fight against the setbacks in guaranteeing continued access to legal abortion in Brazil, we understand that the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, the social movements, the political parties, the parliamentarians, the communicators and influencers that came together were able to resist in an organized way because they understood that it was very important to establish a dialogue, and actually in times of backlash, that was the only way out. So they have been together before the backlash period that began a little bit before Bolsonaro's election, when we had the coup d'etat in Brazil in 2016, and we figured out a little bit that that was something that was really important, a pre-organization. So coalitions, they can be ephemeral and they can be long-lasting. So the longer they last, the greater their social capillarity is, and consequently, the greater their capacity for action. So that was the case. So different actors were already working on reproductive rights. They had founded the National Front for the Legalization of Abortion years before Bolsonaro's government. And Bolsonaro, well, I think it's important to highlight, he's a far-right former military who was elected president, and he governed Brazil from 2019 to 2022. So when Bolsonaro was president during the pandemic, he tried to further restrict the access to legal abortion in Brazil, remembering that in Brazil, the access is only guaranteed in cases of rape, risk to maternal life, and anencephalic fetus. And so there was already an articulation and a dialogue between the groups working on that agenda, with some public and non-public actions, since abortion in general is a crime. And firstly, those groups wanted to expand the right to abortion in Brazil. But when Bolsonaro was elected, it became very clear that it was a necessity to assure that those three very strict and limited options of legal abortion were not taken out. So the reaction was immediate, was very quickly, and with different strategies. And one thing that's very important also to highlight is that all those strategies were taught with great care, with security, due to the criminal possibility of even thinking about the legalization of abortion in Brazil. So the most intense strategy was the social media campaign, which was focused on the difficulty of young girls accessing legal abortion. And they created a hashtag that says, a child is not a mother, a rapist is not a father. And that mobilized much of Brazilian society, given the sensitivity of the issue. But there was also a very strong mobilization among journalists and the mainstream media who hold influence in Brazilian society, and also a very strong action via advocacy in the National Congress with a feminist occupation, where activists spoke directly to federal deputies and senators to draw attention to the issue. Another thing that's important to highlight in coalitions is the understanding of the need to think about these issues in a broader sense and in an intersectional way. So around 20,000 children become mothers every year in Brazil, and more than 70% of them are Black. In this way, the social vulnerability of Black and also Indigenous children become evident. And it's not possible to think about this fight disembodied, so disconnected from who the real subjects are. And as a result of that specific campaign, there has also been a change, although circumstantial, in the way society realized the importance of girls having access to the rights to legal abortion with an intersectional perception. So in this sense, I return to the beginning of my speech. Coalitions are born out of the immediate and concrete needs of those who are suffering. And the cards you made talk about survival. So we are talking about lives here, right? Women, children, people with wombs that are put at risk every day in Brazil. So it's estimated, because it's not possible to have an exact figure, there are that around 7,000 illegal abortions take place every year. And with the difficulty of accessing legal abortion, of course, illegality increases. So people don't stop having abortions in Brazil, even at the risk of imprisonment or death. So that's why one of the coalition's slogans is, "We want each other alive." And that says a lot about survival. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maíra. We're going to move finally to Becky Faith, who is, as Tessa introduced, one of the authors of the card and a senior research fellow at IDS. So Becky, you're going to help us summarize this rich discussion before we move into the plenary. We've heard about countering backlash and different strategies in different contexts. What have you heard as resonating? What have you heard as differing? And how can this help inform our collective efforts to counter backlash?
Thanks, Chloe. And I wanted to say thank you for our incredible panelists for the brilliant work they do as part of the Countering Backlash programme. And wanted just to say also about the cards that when me and Tessa got together to make them, you'd made our lives easy because of the incredible work you'd done. And so as Tessa was saying, when we started looking at these different categories of surviving and centering care, agile activism, creating coalitions, language and story, care for digital practice and capacity building, when we looked at the kind of very rich findings from the observatory's work that our partners have been doing, things kind of fell into place very easily. I hope that the presentation has given a flavour of the very kind of rich, deep work that our partners have been doing. And our goal was never to simplify, to say, oh, it's really easy, you've just got to create a coalition, or you've just got to be careful in digital spaces. But we wanted to kind of spark ideas, solidarities, and some kind of reality checks as well on the kind of realities of this work on the ground. And I think Arundhati's work, which kind of introduced us to from Gender at Work, introduced this notion of survival as a kind of grey zone of holding the line, and it can look like a kind of strategic silence, but in that silence it can, there she emphasized the need for kind of continued hope and a kind of reframing of our own agency, and the importance of continuing community organizing, that this is never going away, just having kind of people on the ground nurturing a new generation of feminists. And I really loved, as Chloe mentioned, the metaphor of the boat, that we need these times to kind of fix our masts and repair holes just to make sure we don't sink. So now got us to reflect on the need for the agile activism in the very challenging context of Lebanon, and just the fact that we need to not see these issues as new, as entirely new, that recognise that as feminists we've been working in these challenging environments for many years, and urging us to kind of look at our histories and learn from those histories as well. Antara's work on and the work that Becky have done on careful digital practices is my kind of home turf, and I think she reflected on the kind of continuous changes in technology, which means that you do have to be agile. So we're seeing globally kind of emergent threats from generative AI being used against women leaders and against women in the public sphere. So as technology changes and in the absence of established legal mechanisms, women are having to kind of respond and make up their own strategies. And Antara talked about the importance of what we might think of as really basic but continued important kind of digital security practices, using secure platforms like Signal, using alternative accounts and strong passwords, but also the many challenges faced in communities where you don't have kind of ubiquitous digital literacy, so you've got a dual challenge there. But again, strategies to survive this and to counter this included peer sharing of knowledge and support groups, and providing kind of responsive access to safe technical and legal support. Finally, now Maíra was talking about their work on creating coalitions, and I love the phrase you used, Maíra, about that the common ground is bigger than the spaces between us, and that of the need for kind of dialogue between these very, very different groups, and actually reminding us that creating dialogue between groups that might not be completely clear where your allyship might lie, but it's actually the only strategy that we can pursue in these difficult times. And also we're talking about how the fact that the longer coalitions last, the more robust they are and the greater their capacity for change. And also some incredible use of sort of digital activism there, the creation of very accessible and kind of impassioned hashtags around access to reproductive rights, that the child is not a mother. So there's some questions coming up in the Q&A that I'm sure we've got some really kind of useful responses here, but I just again wanted to say that we're really hoping that these cards are just the starting point for conversations. They're not a recipe, they're more like some kind of serving suggestions. And I'm really hoping that they start conversations, that we can translate the cards, that we can continue to build on them and learn from each other and give ourselves kind of sort of space and respect for all of the incredible work we're doing as feminists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Becky, and thank you for pulling together some of those threads of what's been a really rich conversation from some amazing speakers. As Becky said, we really hope that the cards are a springboard for discussion, and there are questions and comments coming up in the chat. So I'm going to read a couple of the comments out and then also just pose some of the questions to some speakers specifically. If I can't get to them all, big apologies, and also keep an eye on the written Q&A speakers, and you can respond in writing as well if we don't manage to get to it. The first thing I want to communicate is, if speakers haven't seen, there's much thanks in the chat for all that you do as panel members against the backdrop of very hard situations. And sorry, that's my timer to tell Becky to wrap up. And also comments that the toolkit is really wonderful, that people are excited to share it with others in their network, and thanks for that, and yes to feminist community organizing. So moving on from one more comment with just someone who's working with undocumented migrant communities in the depths of the US. Just finding that Arundhati's comments really resonated in that context as well, which again shows how some of these themes and strategies resonate across different contexts. They wrote that we decided not to do advocacy work, but rather to stay under the radar and survive so that we can keep providing services to our community, which are mostly Indigenous and rural women and children from Latin America. So we're going to move to some questions. I'm going to try my best to address as many of them as possible. First one is around more measures to ensure safer communication. So Antara, you put a toolkit in the chat just to alert people to that. But I'm going to give that question to Becky, first of all. If you could share more on measures and ways to ensure safer communication on social media and apps. And then Antara, if there's anything you'd like to add to it, please jump in. And just to say, we have quite a lot of questions, so as succinctly as people can would be brilliant.
So I think Antara's put a link in the chat or in the Q&A to the toolkit they developed. So yeah, just to kind of reiterate, there's some kind of basic practices that we should all be doing about, Antara was talking about like using strong passwords, not giving away location information, using tools like Signal for communicating with each other, which are a bit safer. And I would say, like, one of the things that came up in Brack's research, Antara's research, was about moving to different platforms as well. Like, if your advocacy is coming under attack on one platform, think about moving to a different platform, say moving from Facebook to Instagram. If you feel like you might be more safe on there, having people that are able to respond in comments. I mean, I think what's difficult is that we haven't got legal frameworks in many countries where women can be guaranteed to be safe online. But if those frameworks are there, then use the legal powers, use the police powers that you have at your fingertips, and use if you have got kind of the police on board, if you have got the authorities on board, then do report these issues as crimes against freedom of speech. Antara, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add.
Not much, just that the toolkit is, we have identified some of the effective strategies, but also the toolkit has resources from different organizations and practitioners who have, identified many other safety or safe navigation of digital space, the safety modules, resources. So we have compiled that, and you can also share and use it as fit to your context.
Great, thank you. A question for Nai. I'm going to pass two questions on to you. One is how to respond to the issue of the burden of being agile. on vulnerable groups who are already under attack. So yeah, if you could speak more to that, to that burden. And the second question, just because I know we've had a lot of conversations with you in relation to the Lebanese context, in relation to the appropriateness of the term backlash. We have a question about the term backlash. Would it also be backlash or just gender injustice in situations, for example, the example they give here is like in Myanmar, when crises are ignored by media within the global north, or in events such as the decimation of US aid funding, meaning the cutting off of water, and so on. So obviously, a lot of these contexts disproportionately affect women and organisations there to support women. So the question is, if this is backlash, where is backlash coming? So if you wanted to speak a little bit more to that kind of continuous episodic, what's gender injustice, what's backlash, and also the burden of being agile in relation to that.
Yeah, I was hoping to not have to subject you to this conversation for the 100th time. But yeah, actually the term, a lot of our conversations around in the program as AIW, like as a Lebanese partner on this, has been around whether backlash is adequate or not, or whether this is like systematic, but also other things. And so what we did is at the beginning of the program, we convened a number of feminist activists and people who work in the field and tried to we came together to try and delineate the different types and the different nuances of this. And yes, there is a systematic inequality, as I said, by virtue of the state being sovereign, like enacting its sovereignty by regulating bodies and basically being sovereign and obvious and violent towards vulnerable groups. But what we did is we also stratified this type of violence. We came up with like a general definition, which I would read it now. It's the various forms of structural discrimination and exclusion that are fed, incubated, and fueled by the sextarian epidermal system. And for more on sextarianism, please refer to Maya Mikdashi's work on sextarianism. It's from 2022. And that I will continue the definition, and that fight and obstruct advocacy for rights, but more importantly, and this is where we differ or diverge from general definitions of backlash, impede the possibility of progress and gains. This structural hostility departs from familial structures, travels across generations, and cuts through governmental, non-governmental institutions of the market. And while this can sound as like the systemic gender injustice, we thought about how we can, because we can see other incidents happening that are more episodic, that are more reactive, but generally we did a three-layered approach, basically, which is one, the systematic backlash, and the second, which we call the tactical backlash, which is basically the way it differs. It's that it recurs in ebbs and flows. It has a cyclical nature. It's synchronicity with national and or regional political junctures, elections, a looming or ongoing war, a tipping point on the lifeline of the system that's marking an existential threat. And it often takes global panics as cover, as we've been seeing in the past few years. And tactical backlash also sets the stage for controversial, most of the time, unconstitutional political moves or reconfigurations that are brought forward to maintain the status quo. And it replaces meaningful and structural remedies for the deep crisis engrossing the country. So it's not, it is less about backlash against queer communities or against LGBTIQ and more of a political a feature or a political move or basically a tool for misplaced political action. So there's systemic, that's the general one that's embedded in the system as a whole. And then there's a tactical backlash that takes a panic over sex or morality as cover to basically safeguard or maintain or extend the longevity of a system. And there's a third, which is the episodic, which is basically incidents that are more of reactions to particular women or particular conversations happening. And most of the time, these three happen together. So that's mostly the way we've conceptualized it. I don't know if I answered the question. I obviously can't talk more about it. There's an entire paper that we wrote on this, but I think it's essential to keep in mind that our contentions with the definition is on four levels. The system in Lebanon and in many other countries, I'm sure it's not exceptional, there's a pronounced intentionality about preventing gains. Is like a major dimension of backlash is basically a reaction to a gain, even if it's just a perceived gain. But in our context, there's a pronounced intentionality about preventing it, and then concerting power in the hands of a minority that's positioned at a specific intersection of sex, gender, legal status, and class. There's a very frail baseline position of women and other vulnerable communities within the system. So there are basic rights denied to them. So claiming power and then having backlash against that is a far-fetched endeavor. And then three, the site from which this quotidian violence originates is family systems into the state. So it flows from the family, from family dynamics and family reconfigurations to the state, and not vice versa. And fourth, as I was trying to explain, that it's a tool of misplaced action. It's an exit strategy, or at least this is how we conceptualized it, for a system in a moment of overlapping crisis. So it's not to say that there isn't any violence or hostility against queer communities, but this hostility is most often embedded in a moment of political peril. And this is something that we need to understand. It's not fear necessarily of what women or queer communities can do. It's mostly, oh, we need to create an enemy because it's not in the interest of anybody, of the political elite or religious elite, to like change the foundations of the game. I hope this clarified.
Yeah, thank you, Nai. And relatedly, I'm going to pose a question to Tessa, which moves on from kind of the word backlash and how we use it. There's a question here about different types of backlash, and the question refers to a kind of rainbow diagram that identifies different forms of backlash, for example, denial, inaction, appeasement, co-option, repression, and more aggressive forms of backlash. So in general, and in relation to the cards, is it helpful to identify different forms of backlash to inform strategies on how to counter it? So if you'd like to speak a little bit to different forms of backlash and how that informs strategies to counter it, that would be great, Tessa.
Thanks, Lewin. Okay, I'll try and do that. I mean, I think effectively, yes, it's always, I think backlash is, as we have discussed already, a very blunt, inadequate, contested term, and has been, rejected and elaborated on and extended by various people. So I think any an analytical disaggregation and articulation of it is very, very helpful. How that maps specifically onto strategies is actually something really interesting to think about. And I don't know the kind of the rainbow or the diagram that you're referring to, but certainly we have in the past looked at clustering counter backlash strategies into things that look at kind of discursive or practical or legal attempts, but not particularly map them onto backlash, I guess, on that spectrum. So I think that, that would be an interesting exercise.
Definitely. Thank you, Tessa. Maíra, a couple of questions. One is, could you speak more to the phrase "a child is not a mother"? How that phrase was used and what was behind that. And secondly, more generally around coalitions, as has been mentioned, challenges are often highly contextualized and very embodied. Do you think that this can cause obstacles to the formation of transnational coalitions, and how best to navigate the search for a common ground in this case?
Yes, so I already kind of answered in the Q&A the first question, but abortion is permitted in case of rape in Brazil. But during Bolsonaro's government, it was even harder to access that right. So, and that's affected especially children, because children, they do need the permission of their parents to get an abortion, of course. And the age of abortion, when abortion is considered a crime for children, is under 14 years old. And unfortunately, we have large numbers of children who got pregnant under 14 years old, usually by a member of the family. And so it's a case of rape inside their homes, so which makes even harder to access that right. And so during Bolsonaro's government, there were several measures, including a decree that put some extra difficulties in accessing legal abortion to children. And so that's the idea of the campaign, is to let people know that it's harder for children to access that right. And so a child is not a mother, a rapist is not a father. I think it's quite obvious, because the argument to sustain that they should keep the pregnancy is in order to have a family. So it creates the idea that the rapist could be a good father for the unborn child. So that the slogan is to dismantle that, to say no, a girl with 10, 11, 12 years old is not a mother, she's a child. And the rapist will never be a father. He is a violator. So I think that's a pretty strong slogan, and that really mobilized Brazilian society during that period, because people got aware that, well, first, those things really happen, and they are very common actually in Brazilian society, and that children should not be forced to endure a pregnancy. And about the second question, I think it's really difficult and challenging to establish coalitions between different movements in an international context, because, as I mentioned earlier, I think coalitions come from basic needs. They come from the reality, from embodied violences. So I think the answers come from the everyday challenges. So in that sense, I think international coalitions are even more challenging. But at the same time, we do have something in common that's happening everywhere, and we can see it very clearly in this panel. There are some contexts and some ways of action of those who are responsible for the backlash that we can identify to and find ways to fight together. So I think what we need to do is just to find those common grounds and try to see what we can do.
Thank you, Maíra. Arundhati, there's 2 questions I want to pose to you. One is about capacity building strategy, where you refer to kind of turning in and building from within. And the questioner says, Arundhati hinted at this with the beautiful boats on chopping seas analogy. So in doing that, what are the key things and areas that we need to be working on and supporting? And the second question refers to the Indian context with regard to the rise of the men's rights groups using laws, domestic violence, sexual harassment laws, and so on, saying that women are going to misuse those laws and that therefore those laws need to be scrapped. Just wondering if you could or would like to share more on how to handle that.
In terms of what capacity building is required, especially for institutions, thinking about feminist institutions and all of that, it's a real moment of reckoning, we think, for civil society, so feminist civil society as a whole, or rights-based civil society as a whole, specifically under the current laws and regulations and under the scrutiny of that a lot of the Muslim rights organizations are facing. We feel that there is now really, this is the time to rethink how we're organizing, and the NGO as the nodal point around which organizing is happening, because it lends itself to such incredible, it's so easy to target and shut down work now. And so one of the things that we want to, that many have expressed the need to sort of revert to almost, is to start thinking again about autonomous organizing and what does that look like in rights-based spaces. How do we continue to do, how do we build capacities to be able to do unfunded work? How do we build capacities to be able to do work that that is harder to pin and target and strategically silence in the ways that institutions are so easy to do? So that's one whole sort of a rethinking bucket that needs to happen. But in terms of existing organizations, a big part of capacities that many organizations talk about building is rethinking resourcing. How do we think beyond specific ways of resourcing our work? How do we move to mutual aid, crowdsourcing? How do we move to other non-monetary forms of resource building? How do we move to community-based forms of resource raising at a time when all of these different buckets of resources, as we know, are shutting down internationally and domestically? So that's another bit of capacity building, and also just co-creating of strategies that needs to be done internally to think about what do our institutions look like, and to also think about another question that was asked in the chat about how do we think about our own internal fractures within feminist movements of workspaces that continue to maybe speak in non-feminist ways, continue to operate with non-feminist strategies. How do we build more inclusive workspaces that are not mirroring the exclusions of society around us, and are not therefore, yeah. So these are all things that have come up through the research that we've done, and a very real fear that current feminist institutions have of not being able to be ready for the next wave of going out to sea. And then in terms of just men's rights groups and some of the backlash that's been happening in India around these laws, traditionally also there has been an incredible amount of visible media posters. There's an incredible poster archive that Zuban, which is a feminist archiving organization in India, has pulled together of just posters across the autonomous women's movement in India, and these have been really interesting because they really start to talk to some of these critiques that come so directly to us. And so some of this kind of direct countering that's been happening is happening on social media. Some of it is happening through memes, some of it is happening through humor, some of it is happening in subversive ways, but it's really interesting also to tap back into the histories of how we have used media and popular media to counter some of this, which are purely discursive. They exist in popular space and are very, very discursive ways to delegitimize the work of feminist organizing? How do we continue to counter that through discursive strategies in popular spaces is something to think about, because that's a space from which a lot of feminist organizations and organizing is retreating because of fear of too much visibility. So really thinking about what does subversion there also look like while continuing to engage with discourse. It's not a direct answer, but something that we're all still thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you, Arundhati. I think all of this is something we're all still thinking about.
Mhm.
I'm going to open a question up for the who would like to answer it, because our speaker who would have spoken to this specifically sadly couldn't join us, but I'm sure that many of you have thoughts. There's 2 or 3 questions around the role of men in countering backlash. So there's one saying, are there any tools or strategies that could be used to increase the allyship of men, and relatedly of what is the role of men in countering backlash? And then there's another question that I think speaks a little bit to kind of discourse capture, potentially, Tessa, around anti-gender movements that have kind of successfully mobilized a crisis of masculinity narratives, where they're portraying feminism as disempowering to men, gender justice as a threat to men and traditional values. So increased economic precarity and social dispossession have fueled narratives, with then men turning to so-called men's rights activism. The questioner very rightly says this co-opts legitimate social concerns like job insecurity and economic concerns, or even men's mental health, and redirects them into misogynistic and anti-feminist rhetoric. So how can gender justice movements respond to these narratives? To what extent should they engage with them at all, given that censoring men's grievances risks diverting attention? Is it strategically useful or even necessary to contest these narratives? Or does doing so inadvertently legitimize them and reinforce the idea that gender justice must accommodate men's perceived losses? So 2 questions there. One, I'm going to give to the whole panel around what's the role of engaging men, what strategies could be used. And one, I'm going to direct more specifically to Tessa around capturing of discourse. So I don't know if anyone would like to jump in.
So do you want me to answer the first and then give people a bit of time to think, or the
Yeah,
second
that would be
first
great.
rather? And
Yeah,
so
thanks, Tessa.
and I guess my answer to the first would be that it's absolutely essential that men are involved in this as well. And I guess in answer to your question around discourse capture or the mobilizing of the narrative or the crisis of masculinity kind of against gender justice, I think it partly talks to Nai's point that none of this is happening in a vacuum, that kind of homophobia and transphobia and misogyny is being kind of mobilized within contexts of political peril and economic crisis, and kind of what people have referred to as the kind of collapse of empire and capitalism and all these kind of polycrises, and not to mention, of course, environmental disasters. And I think that a lot of this is, I've written, as you mentioned, about discourse capture, that it's a kind of a gaslighting where more vulnerable, marginalized people are being vilified and bashed and kind of scapegoated, as we see in political homophobia, for things that are entirely nothing to do with them, right? And that those that are actually more powerful are being kind of made into victims, and this discourse are being kind of twisted. And so as to whether we respond to that, again, this is something we continue to have numerous debates about, like to what extent should we be resisting or regrouping? And I think I think if pushed to give an answer on this, it would be that we have to do both. We can't cede the ground, right? There was a really interesting article I don't know if people saw in the New York Times this week about the words that are now being outlawed. So we used to have kind of burning of books, but now we're actually having words that are that the Trump regime are excluding from policy areas, and it's quite an extensive list. I don't know if I can find it, but I'll copy the article into the chat because it was really fascinating. So I think that we obviously, there's a danger of engaging and highlighting some of this discourse, but there's also a danger of not engaging. And obviously we don't want to put all our energies into fighting back, because we also need to be, you know, as I guess indicated by the framing in our cards, we need to first of all be surviving. We also need to be regrouping. But I think we can't afford to cede the ground entirely. Yeah, and then maybe others want to come in on the involving men.
I could say a couple of words, but more about the issue of kind of toxic masculinity online and how we address this issue. And I went to a very interesting presentation at RightsCon by the Sexual Violence Prevention Association. And I think what was really interesting to me was when you're preventing online harms, deep fakes and so on, our first sort of strategy would be kind of stopping boys wanting to do this in the first place. So this is working on kind of social norms around the fact that currently you're given a lot of kind of online kudos for this kind of activity, and actually getting boys to not want to do this in the first place, and then introducing a lot of technological friction and barriers through things like really getting schools involved, teaching kids about responsible online practices, and that schools and colleges have policies where boys who might be kind of playing around with the kind of Andrew Tate type content realize that it's actually they're going to get sanctioned for it at school. So that's just my take on the kind of online part of this. I see my colleagues have got hands up.
Thank you, Becky. Maíra, and then NEIM.
I just wanted to thanks also for the question, because I just started to think about what a rapist, not a father, means in terms of masculinity. And I think that's really interesting because it shows somehow what people, or at least feminists, think the role of a father should be. And so by the negation of it, what it shouldn't, so a rapist is not a father, but it doesn't propose what it is a father, what should be a father, what's the role of a father in a non-patriarchal sense, non-violent sense. So that's kind of tricky because you only see it from the negative point of view. So I think maybe that's something that feminists should consider when they are campaigning. So to think what kind of message you're proposing also to men, to masculinity, what kind of masculinity are you talking about? And that's something that a slogan, a rapist, not a father, doesn't say. So that's I just wanted to think about that. And I think the answer is always to think that gender is a social relation. So we cannot forget that this is built between people that are in a hierarchical relation. And that's important to notice. So we don't talk only to women, we don't talk only to men, we talk to both of them or to many of them when we're thinking about in a queer point of view as well. So we're just talking about social relations. And I think that's something that we should always keep in mind.
Thank you, Maíra. NEIM.
Yeah, I want to link this to the question on the burden of being, like the burden of agile activism, and not to speak against like the popular theme on this, but I think a lot of what we do or end up doing, at least as feminists, in general, and more particularly like in Lebanon in times of crisis, when we have to like adapt our operations to, you know, to put up with the times and to fill gaps that are left by the other entities that are supposed to be doing their job. I think a lot of the times we end up doing a lot of explaining, and we forget that the knowledge is out there, and plenty of examples of good parenting and like non-toxic masculinities and allyship are there. And a lot of the times what me and so many of my feminist peers started to like make a point of doing is to be like, this is not our job. Like, our job is not to tell the toxic men in our lives what to do and what not to do. And I think there's a lot of infantilization of the men in that regard if we keep on doing it that explicitly. Now, that said, so many allies, like men allies, are putting forward really good examples, and I think there's a lot for men to learn from each other. And also the fact that we're talking about men is like homogenizing them, and it's a lot of it for us is where they stand, like where they're positioned politically, and a way for us to kind of ease that burden is to basically delegate. So people take on every single person takes on the group that's more like them and works with them, as opposed to us going around and saying like, hi, don't harass the woman on the street, this could be your sister or whatever. Like, I think there's a lot of we need to talk more about this and about how we ease the burden and how we actually trust the people who have been in our circles long enough to know what's right. And like one litmus test that we have been seeing, or like we always talk about, is, and we've talked about it in the program quite a lot, is on like safe claims and the risky claims, and how do we know if the people in our groups or in the network are actually true allies, is when they don't back down or they don't retract when the claim is big enough or radical enough or basically touches on their privileges. And that's how we know who the true allies are. And unfortunately, this is when so many of the men who we think are allies basically remove themselves from these circles. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we need to trust the men in our circles to be doing their own work, as opposed to be going around being like, do this and don't do that, and see what you did there is wrong. Because the knowledge is out there, the examples are out there, and so there's no reason for us to be doing 6 jobs at the same time. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. No. And relatedly, to some extent, moving on, but related, there's a question around building coalitions that, again, I'm going to open up to any of you to respond. And Maíra's touched on it a bit as well, around the increased polarization and lack of trust, and the increased fractures within movements and within the larger feminist movement. And again, it's that question of, wanting to expand, but also wanting to keep a somewhat kind of radical and focused message. So would anyone want to share any insights on what work within this context of increased polarization and lack of trust? And then we'll move to one more question before we close. So Hella.
Yeah, you mentioned coalitions. That's what the strand works on in the voice strand that is part of Countering Backlash, that looks at basically not just how do you form coalitions, but how do you sustain, right? So Maíra hinted at that long coalitions that have been functional for a long time, that there is a lot of social and political capital there that keeps on functioning, even when you're hitting crisis. Now, the thing to remember is coalitions are not fuzzy, comfortable, warm spaces. They're contentious spaces. There will be contention. Now, it is about the nature of contention and how do you handle contention. A lot of the time, what we are seeing in terms of fragmentation or polarization is that we forget how to work with difference instead of we sort of form coalitions thinking in spite of differences, we'll just sort of work on this specific issue. And that doesn't give you a solid grounding, right? Coalition building is an uncomfortable work, and there are going to be disagreements. You have to take that on board and then work with it. Now, it's also about understanding what is that difference about, right? And whether there is, how do you create that space to have that dialogue? But at the same time, there are short-term strategic goals, and then there are long-term goals that you want to hold and sustain. So splitting that, and of course, acknowledging the emotions that come up as you engage with these and not just burying them. Now, these are not concrete things in terms of like, oh, well, do this and it will solve this. This is basically thinking through reflectively and getting your partners engaged in that process, right? So I'm going to stop there.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Sahela. There is a question in the chat that I don't think we'll have time to respond to, but Ben, I'm wondering if you could pop a resource in the chat that I know will speak well to it. There's a question here around the subject of backlash, obviously dating far back in history and fast forwarding to the present. What was mentioned was the notion of locating a common perpetrator. And the question is if people could expand their thoughts on this, but I'm afraid we're running out of time, but so you have a hand half up, go on.
I just wanted to say something really briefly, and I think it's important to remember that we can't divide the world into backlash actors and counter backlash actors, and that many of us at times are both, and so we need to be cautious about polarization in our own kind of analytical thinking around this, right? And that we've seen actors that we regard as deeply unprogressive doing incredibly progressive things and vice versa, and so I just think that's important to bear in mind.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I mean, what we're trying to do is undo binaries and the hierarchies that come along with that, and we don't want to impose binaries then into our own work and conceptions of things. So we do have to come to a close. We have a minute left. So Hella, you were just going to tell everyone about a forthcoming event before we close.
Yes, please, and thank you, Chloe. The reason why I'm crashing this panel is to talk to you guys about the event that's coming. This is on March 17th from 1 to 3 p.m. New York time. This is at UN headquarters. So if you want to continue the conversation that you have heard, and it's partly about getting together with allies we know, but it's also about forming new alliances and thinking through what do we do now. So regrouping, re-strategizing, the conversation is around that. So please do come and join us. Ben has put in the details in the chat. So if you are in New York, want to come and join us and take the conversation forward, please do email the email that Ben has put in the chat and let us know. So because we do need names for entering the UN building, so we can let them know that you're coming. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahela. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending this discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists for the amazing and thought-provoking insights that you've offered. I know there is much behind it, so please do everybody go into the various resources that have been shared in the chat, and you'll also find more attached to them. And now you mentioned what is our job when you were talking, saying that's not our job. Yes, one thing I want to end on is what is our job? Our job is not easy. Our job is to work together collectively, consciously, intersectionally, critically, to together counter backlash and one day build the feminist, queer and decolonial future that we have not yet seen realized. So with that, please do have a look at the cards, please do add to them, please do use them as a springboard to build on, share them in your networks. And I look forward to seeing, hearing and learning from many of you in different spaces moving forward. with many thanks to our panelists and many thanks for attending.
Thanks so much, Chloe. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.